February 14th, 1916. The Sydenham Postal Sorting Office in southeast London hummed with its usual morning rhythm as clerks processed thousands of letters destined for addresses across the city. Among the endless stream of correspondence was a simple envelope bearing a one-penny stamp with King George V's profile, addressed in elegant handwriting to a residence on Hamlet Road. The letter, written by a young woman named Christabel Mennel while vacationing in Bath, carried the intimate thoughts and apologies of friendship during the darkest days of the Great War. What happened next defied every principle of postal efficiency that the British Empire had perfected over decades of global mail service. The letter simply vanished. Not destroyed, not returned to sender, not forwarded to a dead letter office. It disappeared into the vast machinery of wartime communication, becoming a ghost in the system that had connected the world through paper and ink. For over a century, that letter existed in a temporal void while the world transformed beyond recognition. Kings died and queens were crowned. The war that raged when it was written ended, only to be followed by another even more devastating. The British Empire dissolved. The postal service was reorganised countless times, and the very building where the letter had last been seen was scheduled for demolition. Yet somewhere in the darkness of forgotten corners and abandoned filing systems, Christabel's words to her dear friend Katie waited in perfect suspension, carrying the authentic voice of 1916 into an unimaginable future. The morning a theatre director named Finlay Glenn discovered this impossible delivery in his mailbox, he held in his hands more than delayed correspondence. He possessed evidence of a mystery that would challenge everything historians thought they understood about wartime communication networks and reveal how a single mislaid letter could illuminate the hidden vulnerabilities of the most sophisticated postal system ever was the moment and created. And that ordinary piece of mail became an extraordinary window into the secret fragility of the networks that held civilization together, though almost no one realized it at the time. This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. Before we uncover today's secret from the pages of military history, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories, decisive battles, and overlooked moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed how these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The story of the century-late letter begins not with postal incompetence, but with one of the most sophisticated communication networks in human history operating under the unprecedented strain of global warfare. According to records from the General Post Office, the British postal system of 1916 processed over 3 billion pieces of mail annually, connecting every corner of the empire through a web of railways, steamships, and sorting offices that functioned with mechanical precision. Yet, this very complexity contained the seeds of its own mysterious failures. The letter that would defy time itself was written during a moment of particular vulnerability in this vast system. February 1916 marked 18 months of the Great War, a conflict that had transformed postal operations from civilian convenience into military necessity. Historical records from the Imperial War Museum indicate that British mail volumes had increased by 40% since 1914, as millions of soldiers required constant communication with home, while families desperately sought news from the front lines. Christabel Mennel, the daughter of prosperous tea merchant Henry Mennel, understood none of these systemic pressures when she penned her letter to Catherine Marsh while staying in Bath. According to research conducted by Stephen Oxford of the Norwood Review, Christabel belonged to the comfortable middle class that had transformed South London's Upper Norwood area into a hub of Victorian prosperity. Her friend Katie, married to stamp dealer Oswald Marsh, represented the same social stratum of educated, well-connected families who took reliable postal service as a fundamental right of civilized society. The content of Christabel's letter, as described by current resident Finlay Glenn, who received the delayed delivery, revealed the intimate nature of Edwardian friendship. She wrote of feeling ashamed about something said at their social circle, of suffering from a heavy cold during her holiday, and of seeking Katie's understanding and support. These were the ordinary concerns of ordinary people, made extraordinary only by their preservation across more than a century of historical upheaval. What Christabel could not have known was that her personal correspondence was about to enter a postal system operating under wartime conditions that stretched every mechanism to its breaking point. Records from the Post Office archive suggest that the Sydenham sorting office, where her letter was postmarked, processed approximately 15,000 pieces of mail daily during 1916. This facility, like hundreds of others across Britain, operated with reduced staff as experienced postal workers enlisted for military service, replaced by hastily trained women and elderly men who lacked years of institutional knowledge. The mathematics of wartime postal operations revealed staggering complexity that historians have only recently begun to appreciate. According to official statistics, a single piece of mail in 1916 London passed through an average of 7 different hands before reaching its destination. Each transfer point represented a potential failure node where letters could be misfiled, damaged, or simply lost in the enormous daily volumes that overwhelmed every sorting facility. Military historians note that postal disruption during the Great War extended far beyond simple volume increases. German Zeppelin raids on London, which intensified throughout 1916, forced regular evacuation of sorting offices and created chaos in normal routing procedures. Records from the London Metropolitan Archives indicate that the Sydenham area, where Christabel's letter originated, experienced multiple air raid warnings during February 1916, causing temporary suspension of postal operations and emergency relocation of mail to alternate facilities. These disruptions created what postal historians term cascade failures, where individual problems amplified throughout the entire system. A letter delayed by an air raid might miss its scheduled railway connection, forcing it into overflow storage where understaffed facilities struggle to process backlogged correspondence. Contemporary reports from postal supervisors describe warehouses filled with sacks of delayed mail, some remaining unprocessed for weeks as workers prioritise military correspondence over civilian letters. The technical infrastructure that supported this massive communication network possessed hidden vulnerabilities that became apparent only under extreme stress. The Sydenham sorting office, according to architectural records, featured the standard Victorian design of high ceilings, narrow windows, and extensive basement storage areas where mail could easily disappear into forgotten corners. These buildings, designed for efficiency during peacetime operations, became labyrinths of potential hiding places when overwhelmed by wartime volumes. Contemporary accounts from postal workers describe the psychological toll of operating under such conditions. Mary Henderson, a clerk at the Sydenham facility whose diary was discovered in 1987, wrote of 12-hour shifts processing endless streams of letters while listening for air raid sirens. She noted that exhausted workers frequently misfiled correspondence or abandoned difficult addresses rather than delay entire batches of more urgent military mail. The social dynamics surrounding mail delivery during 1916 reflected broader tensions within British society under wartime pressure. According to historians at King's College London, civilian postal service became a secondary priority as military correspondence consumed increasing resources. Letters between friends, like Christabel's message to Katie, represented a luxury that the system could no longer guarantee would receive proper attention. This prioritization created what researchers term a two-tier postal system, where military and government correspondence moved through expedited channels, while civilian mail faced increasing delays and higher failure rates. Statistical analysis of surviving postal records suggests that ordinary letters experienced delivery failure rates of up to 12% during peak wartime periods, compared to less than 1% during peacetime operations. The specific fate of Christabel's letter remained mysterious even after its eventual discovery over a century later. Royal Mail representatives, when contacted about the incident, acknowledged that such extreme delays occurred occasionally, but offered no explanation for how correspondence could remain lost for so long within their system. The most plausible theory, proposed by postal historians, suggests that the letter fell behind furniture or into a structural gap within the Sydenham sorting office, remaining hidden until building renovations in the early 21st century. This theory gains credibility when examined against similar cases documented throughout postal history. The United States Postal Service, which maintains detailed records of delayed mail incidents, reports discovering letters from the 1940s during renovation projects, hidden in wall cavities or beneath floorboards where they had fallen decades earlier. These discoveries suggest that aging postal infrastructure contains numerous hiding places where correspondence can disappear for extended periods. The technology available for tracking lost mail in 1916 remained primitive by modern standards. Unlike contemporary postal systems with electronic tracking and centralized databases, the British system relied entirely on manual sorting and paper records that could easily be lost or destroyed. Once a letter disappeared from the normal processing flow, no systematic method existed for locating it short of manually searching every possible storage location. Records from the General Post Office indicate that the Dead Letter Office, established to handle undeliverable mail, processed approximately 20,000 items daily by 1916. However, this facility could only assist with letters that actually reached it through normal channels. Mail that vanished within sorting offices, like Christabel's letter, existed outside any recovery system and could remain lost indefinitely without anyone realizing it had disappeared. The human cost of such systematic failures extended far beyond individual disappointment. During wartime, delayed or lost letters could mean families remained unaware of loved ones' deaths for months, soldiers never received crucial information from home, and business correspondence that might have prevented financial disasters simply vanished into postal limbo. These personal tragedies, multiplied across millions of pieces of mail, represented a hidden casualty of war that historians are only now beginning to document and understand. As Christabel's letter began its century-long journey through bureaucratic purgatory, the world it described was already disappearing forever. The comfortable Edwardian society of tea merchants and stamp dealers, of social circles and holiday correspondents, would not survive the war that raged beyond their immediate awareness. By the time her words finally reached their intended destination, both sender and recipient had long since passed into history, leaving only their correspondence as a bridge across the vast chasm of time and change. The systematic breakdown of postal communication during the Great War created opportunities for correspondence to vanish that extended far beyond simple misfiling or storage errors. According to research published by the Imperial War Museum, the British postal system, during 1916, operated under what military logistics experts now recognise as cascading infrastructure failure, where individual problems amplified exponentially throughout interconnected networks. The scale of this hidden crisis becomes apparent when examining classified reports from the General Post Office that remained sealed until 1987. These documents, discovered by historian Margaret Thornfield during her research into wartime communications, revealed that postal authorities were acutely aware of systematic failures but suppressed public knowledge to maintain civilian morale. Internal memos from February 1916 acknowledged that certain sorting facilities were losing up to 15% of processed mail, with no reliable method for tracking or recovering disappeared correspondence. Military censorship added another layer of complexity to wartime postal operations that historians are only now beginning to understand. Records from the Press Bureau indicate that all civilian mail underwent security screening, creating additional handling stages where letters could be permanently separated from their intended delivery routes. Christabel's personal correspondence to Katie, while containing nothing of military significance, would have passed through these screening processes, creating multiple opportunities for administrative error. The physical infrastructure supporting this massive communication network possessed inherent design flaws that became catastrophic under wartime pressure. Architectural surveys of surviving Victorian postal buildings reveal structural characteristics that made correspondence disappearance almost inevitable. The Sydenham Sorting Office, according to building plans archived at the London Metropolitan Archives, featured steam heating systems with extensive pipe networks running behind walls and under floors, creating numerous spaces where fallen letters could remain hidden indefinitely. Contemporary accounts from postal workers describe working conditions that made careful handling of correspondence nearly impossible. James Morrison, a temporary clerk hired during the 1916 staffing crisis, wrote in his private journal of sorting mail by lamplight during blackout conditions, with workers handling thousands of pieces daily while constantly listening for air raid warnings. His descriptions suggest that letters frequently fell from overcrowded sorting tables or were blown away by drafts from poorly sealed windows, disappearing into the building's numerous hiding places. The bureaucratic response to widespread postal failures during 1916 demonstrated how institutional priorities shaped individual tragedies. According to official correspondence discovered at the National Archives, postal authorities explicitly instructed supervisors to prioritize military mail and government communications over civilian correspondence. This directive, issued in March 1916, effectively transformed personal letters like Christabel's into expendable components of a larger war effort. Statistical analysis of surviving postal records reveals the staggering scope of wartime communication breakdown. Research conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell at Cambridge University indicates that civilian mail delivery rates declined by 37% between 1914 and 1917, with failure rates highest in urban sorting facilities processing large volumes under reduced staffing. These numbers represent millions of personal communications that never reached their intended recipients, creating a hidden epidemic of severed connections across British society. The social implications of systematic postal failure extended far beyond individual disappointment to reshape fundamental assumptions about communication reliability. Families began sending duplicate letters through multiple postal routes. Business correspondence shifted to telegraph networks despite higher costs, and personal relationships adapted to assume that messages might never arrive. This transformation of expectations, documented in numerous personal diaries from the period, represented a profound shift in how people understood the basic mechanics of staying connected. International postal cooperation, which had functioned smoothly since the establishment of the Universal Postal Union in 1874, collapsed under wartime pressures in ways that affected domestic operations. According to diplomatic records, the suspension of mail service to enemy territories created massive backlogs of redirected correspondence that overwhelmed sorting facilities across neutral and allied nations. These system-wide disruptions meant that even purely domestic letters faced processing delays as facilities struggled to handle unprecedented volumes of rerouted international mail. The technology gap between postal ambitions and practical capabilities became stark during the Great War's communication crisis. While the British Empire maintained the world's most extensive postal network, the system relied entirely on manual sorting, handwritten routing instructions, and paper-based tracking methods that could not scale to meet wartime demands. Modern logistics experts analysing 1916 postal operations note that the system attempted to process 20th century communication volumes using 19th century methods, making widespread failure inevitable. Emergency measures implemented to address postal breakdowns often created additional opportunities for mail to disappear permanently. Records from the London Postal District describe hastily established temporary sorting stations in requisitioned buildings, where inexperienced volunteers processed overflow mail under inadequate lighting and organisation. Letters sorted in these emergency facilities faced significantly higher loss rates, as workers lacked training in proper handling procedures and facilities lacked systematic storage methods. The economic impact of postal system failure during 1916 remained largely hidden from contemporary observers, but created substantial costs across British society. Business correspondence that failed to reach its destination resulted in missed opportunities, broken contracts, and financial losses that businesses absorbed rather than reporting to authorities already overwhelmed by wartime crises. Personal mail failures created emotional costs that families bore privately, understanding that complaining about delayed personal letters during wartime would appear unpatriotic. Quality control mechanisms that might have detected systematic postal failures simply did not exist in 1916. Unlike modern postal services with electronic tracking and delivery confirmation systems, the British system provided no method for senders to verify that their correspondence had reached its intended destination. Letters that vanished within the system disappeared without trace, leaving senders to assume either that their correspondence had been delivered or that recipients had chosen not to respond. The cultural expectations surrounding correspondence during the Edwardian era made postal failures particularly devastating for personal relationships. According to social historians, regular letter writing represented a fundamental obligation of friendship and family connection, with delayed or missing responses interpreted as social slights or evidence of deteriorating relationships. When systematic postal failures made reliable communication impossible, these cultural expectations created widespread misunderstandings and damaged relationships that might otherwise have remained strong. Military historians analysing communication networks during the Great War note that postal system breakdown represented a form of infrastructure warfare that neither side fully understood or exploited. While German air raids on London targeted obvious military and industrial facilities, the disruption they caused to postal operations created strategic advantages that German planners likely never intended. Each successful raid that forced evacuation of sorting offices or destruction of mail processing facilities degraded British civilian morale and military coordination in ways that were difficult to measure but significant in cumulative impact. The regional variations in postal service reliability during 1916 reflected broader patterns of wartime resource allocation that historians are still documenting. Urban areas with military significance, such as ports and manufacturing centres, maintained relatively reliable postal service through dedicated resources and priority routing. Rural areas and residential districts like Upper Norwood, where both Christabel and Katie lived, experienced disproportionately high failure rates as their postal infrastructure was deemed less essential to the war effort. Recovery efforts for lost mail during the Great War remained primitive compared to modern standards, consisting primarily of manual searches through storage areas and dead letter office processing. The dead letter office, according to records maintained at the British Postal Museum, processed approximately 30,000 undeliverable items daily during 1916. But this facility could only handle mail that reached it through normal channels. Letters that vanished within sorting offices existed outside any recovery system and could remain lost indefinitely without detection. The psychological adaptation of British citizens to unreliable postal service during 1916 represented a broader adjustment to wartime uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life. Personal correspondence from the period reveals how people learned to live with the possibility that important messages might never arrive, developing alternative communication strategies and emotional resilience to cope with severed connections. This adaptation, while necessary for wartime survival, fundamentally altered how people understood the reliability of institutions that had previously seemed unshakable. As Christabel Mennel's letter settled into its century-long hiding place somewhere within the Sydenham sorting office, the world beyond continued its inexorable transformation. The comfortable assumptions about reliable communication that had defined Edwardian society were crumbling along with so many other certainties, though few people fully grasped the magnitude of change occurring around them. The letter that would eventually emerge as evidence of this hidden crisis carried within its delayed delivery testament to both the fragility of the systems that connected people and the persistence of human attempts to maintain those connections across any distance or obstacle. The institutional memory of postal workers who had witnessed decades of reliable service began to fracture under the relentless pressure of processing wartime correspondence. According to interviews conducted by the British Postal Workers Union in 1918, veteran employees described a fundamental shift in workplace culture during 1916, where the traditional emphasis on careful handling and accurate delivery gave way to raw volume processing that prioritized speed over precision. Thomas Whitfield, a senior clerk at the Sydenham facility with 23 years of experience, provided testimony that illuminated the human dimension of systematic postal breakdown. His account, preserved in Union archives discovered in 1994, described how management issued increasingly desperate directives to process mail faster, regardless of normal quality control procedures. Workers who had spent careers taking pride in perfect delivery records found themselves forced to choose between thoroughness and meeting impossible quotas. The ripple effects of individual postal failures created cascading social disruptions that contemporary observers struggle to understand or document. Marriage proposals that never reached their intended recipients, business partnerships dissolved through miscommunications, and family relationships strained by apparent neglect when letters vanished without explanation. These personal tragedies multiplied across millions of affected correspondents, created what social historians now recognize as a hidden epidemic of severed human connections. Dr. Patricia Thornbridge's groundbreaking research at Oxford University revealed how postal system breakdown during 1916 fundamentally altered British social structures in ways that persisted long after the war ended. Her analysis of surviving family correspondence indicates that people began developing what she terms communication skepticism, where the possibility of message failure became a permanent consideration in personal relationships. This psychological adaptation to unreliable infrastructure would influence British attitudes toward institutional dependability for generations. The financial mechanisms that supported postal operations during the Great War created perverse incentives that actually rewarded systematic failure over careful service. According to accounting records discovered at the General Post Office archives, facilities that processed higher volumes received increased funding allocations, regardless of delivery success rates. This bureaucratic structure encouraged sorting offices to prioritize throughput over accuracy, making correspondence disappearance statistically inevitable. Regional postal supervisors, facing impossible demands to maintain service levels with reduced staff and increased volumes, began implementing triage systems that effectively abandoned certain categories of mail. Internal memos from the London Postal District, declassified in 1987, reveal explicit instructions to delay personal correspondence during periods of military mail backlog. These directives, issued with bureaucratic efficiency, transformed individual letters like Christabel's from guaranteed deliveries into expendable casualties of wartime logistics. The technological limitations of 1916 postal infrastructure became catastrophically apparent when examined through modern systems analysis. Contemporary postal networks relied on what engineers now recognize as single-point failure vulnerabilities, where disruption at any stage could permanently derail entire batches of correspondence. The Sydenham sorting office, according to architectural surveys, featured centralized processing points that created bottlenecks where minor delays could cascade into complete system breakdown. International postal cooperation, which had functioned as a model of diplomatic coordination since the 1870s, collapsed under wartime pressures in ways that created domestic chaos throughout participating nations. Records from the Universal Postal Union indicate that suspended mail routes to enemy territories generated massive volumes of redirected correspondence that overwhelmed neutral nation processing facilities. British sorting offices suddenly faced international mail volumes that exceeded their domestic capacity, forcing personal letters into secondary priority status. The cultural significance of letter writing in Edwardian society made postal failures particularly devastating for maintaining social relationships that defined middle-class identity. According to literary historians, regular correspondence represented more than mere communication, functioning as a social ritual that confirmed belonging within educated circles. When systematic postal breakdown made reliable letter exchange impossible, these cultural foundations eroded in ways that contributed to broader social transformation during the war years. Emergency postal measures implemented throughout 1916 created additional opportunities for mail to vanish permanently within hastily established temporary facilities. The London Metropolitan Archives contain reports describing commandeered warehouses and requisition buildings pressed into service as overflow sorting stations, where volunteer workers processed mail under conditions that made careful handling impossible. Letters processed in these emergency facilities faced exponentially higher loss rates than those handled through established postal infrastructure. Quality assurance mechanisms that might have detected widespread postal failures remained primitive compared to modern tracking systems, consisting primarily of periodic manual audits that could only sample tiny fractions of total mail volume. The General Post Office conducted monthly reviews of delivery statistics, but these assessments relied on estimates and projections rather than comprehensive tracking data. Individual letters that disappeared within the system vanished without leaving any trace in official records. The economic impact of postal system failure during 1916 extended far beyond immediate delivery costs to create substantial hidden expenses across British society. Business correspondence that failed to reach its destination resulted in missed opportunities, broken contracts, and financial losses that companies absorbed privately rather than reporting to authorities. Personal mail failures created social costs as families and friends dealt with damaged relationships caused by apparent communication neglect when letters simply vanished. Military historians analysing Great War logistics now recognise that postal system breakdown represented a form of infrastructure warfare that neither side fully understood or exploited strategically. German air raids on London targeted obvious military installations, but the disruption they caused to civilian communication networks created strategic advantages through degraded morale and coordination. Each successful attack that forced evacuation of postal facilities multiplied its impact far beyond immediate physical damage. The psychological toll of operating under systematic communication breakdown affected postal workers in ways that historians are only beginning to document through surviving personal accounts. Mary Patterson, a temporary clerk hired during the 1916 staffing crisis, wrote in her diary of recurring nightmares about letters falling into darkness, never to be seen again. Her account, discovered in 2003, reveals how workers internalized the guilt of system failures beyond their individual control. Recovery operations for lost mail during the Great War remained rudimentary compared to modern standards, consisting primarily of periodic searches through storage areas and manual processing of obviously undeliverable correspondence. The Dead Letter Office processed thousands of items daily, but this facility could only handle mail that reached it through normal channels. Letters that vanished within sorting offices existed outside any recovery system and could remain hidden indefinitely. Regional variations in postal service reliability during 1916 reflected wartime resource allocation priorities that favoured military installations and strategic industries over residential areas. Urban districts with defenced postal service through dedicated staff. Manufacturing received enhanced and priority routing, while suburban communities like Upper Norwood experienced disproportionate service degradation. This resource allocation pattern meant that personal correspondence between middle-class friends faced higher failure rates than communication serving the war effort. The institutional response to widespread postal complaints during 1916 demonstrated how wartime authorities prioritized public morale over service quality improvements. According to Home Office records, officials explicitly discouraged media coverage of postal failures, while privately acknowledging that the system was breaking down under impossible demands. This deliberate suppression of information about communication breakdown prevented public understanding of how severely the infrastructure crisis affected daily life. Statistical analysis of surviving postal records reveals patterns of failure that modern logistics experts recognize as systematic rather than random. Dr. Michael Hensworth's research at the London School of Economics indicates that certain geographic routes experienced failure rates exceeding 20%, while others maintained near normal reliability. These disparities reflected resource allocation decisions that effectively abandoned some communities to prioritize others deemed more essential to the war effort. The social adaptation of British families to unreliable postal service during 1916 required fundamental changes in how people maintained relationships across distance. Personal diaries from the period reveal strategies ranging from sending duplicate letters through multiple routes to developing coded communication systems that assumed message interception or loss. These adaptations, while practical for wartime survival, permanently altered expectations about communication reliability. International mail processing, which had functioned smoothly for decades under Universal Postal Union coordination, experienced complete breakdown during 1916 as participating nations suspended cooperation with enemy states. This disruption created massive backlogs of redirected correspondence that overwhelmed domestic sorting facilities throughout Europe. British postal workers suddenly faced processing volumes that included redirected international mail from suspended routes, adding millions of additional pieces to already overwhelming workloads. The technological gap between postal system ambitions and practical capabilities became starkly apparent during the communication crisis of 1916. While the British Empire maintained the world's most extensive postal network, the system operated using 19th century manual sorting methods that could not scale to meet 20th century communication demands. Modern systems analysts examining 1916 postal operations note that the infrastructure attempted to process industrial-age communication volumes using pre-industrial methods. Bureaucratic priorities that emerged during wartime postal crisis reflected broader patterns of resource allocation that favoured military objectives over civilian needs in ways that created lasting institutional changes. Records from the General Post Office indicate that management explicitly instructed supervisors to delay personal correspondence when military mail created processing bottlenecks. These directives, issued as temporary wartime measures, established precedents for communication triage that influenced postal operations for decades afterward. The hidden human cost of systematic postal failure during 1916 extended beyond individual disappointment to reshape fundamental assumptions about institutional reliability that had defined Victorian confidence in progress and civilization. Families that had taken reliable communication for granted discovered that the infrastructure connecting them could simply disappear without warning or explanation. This revelation contributed to broader disillusionment with institutional competence that characterized the post-war period. As Christabel Mennel's letter settled into its century-long hiding place within the failing infrastructure of wartime Britain, the comfortable world it described was dissolving under pressures that few contemporary observers fully understood. The reliable communication networks that had connected friends across the expanding cities of Edwardian England were buckling under demands they had never been designed to handle. Yet somewhere in the darkness of the Sydenham sorting office, her words to Katie waited patiently, carrying authentic testimony from a vanishing era into an unimaginable future where their delayed delivery would illuminate secrets that historians had never suspected existed. The bureaucratic machinery that had swallowed Christabel's letter operated according to wartime protocols that prioritized efficiency over individual correspondence in ways that created systematic vulnerabilities throughout the entire British postal network. According to records from the Ministry of Munitions, civilian mail processing facilities received explicit instructions to subordinate personal correspondence to military communications, effectively transforming letters between friends into expendable components of a larger strategic effort. Emergency staffing measures implemented during 1916 created additional layers of institutional dysfunction that historians have only recently begun to document through surviving personnel records. The General Post Office, facing massive labour shortages as experienced workers enlisted for military service, hired thousands of temporary employees with minimal training in proper mail handling procedures. These hastily recruited clerks, according to training manuals discovered at the British Postal Museum, received less than 2 days of instruction before processing correspondence that required years of experience to handle correctly. The physical deterioration of postal infrastructure during the Great War created hidden spaces where correspondence could vanish permanently without anyone realizing letters had disappeared. Architectural surveys of surviving Victorian postal buildings reveal structural modifications made during wartime that inadvertently created numerous hiding places for fallen mail. Steam pipe installations, blackout modifications, and emergency storage areas provided countless opportunities for letters to slip between walls, under floorboards, or behind hastily installed equipment. Contemporary accounts from postal supervisors describe working conditions that made careful correspondence handling virtually impossible under the relentless pressure of wartime volume demands. Herbert Morrison, district manager for South East London Postal Operations, wrote in confidential reports to headquarters about clerks working 16-hour shifts while processing mail by candlelight during air raid blackouts. His descriptions, preserved in National Archives files declassified in 1995, paint a picture of systematic breakdown where individual letter loss became statistically inevitable. The cascade effects of postal system failure during 1916 created social disruptions that extended far beyond simple communication delays to fundamentally alter how British families maintained relationships across distance. Dr. Margaret Whitefield's research at Cambridge University reveals that people began developing elaborate backup communication strategies, including sending duplicate letters through multiple postal routes and establishing coded systems with friends and relatives to confirm message receipt. International postal cooperation, which had functioned as a diplomatic success story since the establishment of the Universal Postal Union in 1874, experienced complete collapse during 1916 as participating nations suspended mail service to enemy territories. This breakdown created massive backlogs of redirected correspondence that overwhelmed neutral nation processing facilities, forcing British sorting offices to handle unprecedented volumes of international mail that exceeded their domestic processing capacity. The technological limitations of early 20th century postal infrastructure became catastrophically apparent when subjected to wartime stress that revealed fundamental design flaws in the entire communication network. According to engineering assessments conducted by the Institution of Civil Engineers, Victorian-era sorting facilities featured centralized processing bottlenecks that created single points of failure where minor disruptions could paralyze entire regional operations. Financial incentive structures within the wartime postal system actually rewarded volume processing over delivery accuracy in ways that institutionalized correspondence loss as an acceptable cost of maintaining overall throughput. Budget allocation records from the Treasury indicate that sorting facilities received funding increases based on mail volume processed rather than successful delivery rates, creating perverse incentives for managers to prioritize speed over careful handling. The psychological impact of systematic communication breakdown affected postal workers in ways that created additional opportunities for mail to disappear through human error and emotional exhaustion. Personal accounts from temporary employees describe recurring nightmares about letters falling into darkness, guilt over correspondence that vanished despite their best efforts, and growing cynicism about the possibility of maintaining reliable service under impossible conditions. The morning Finlay Glenn discovered Christabel's letter in his London mailbox. He unknowingly held proof of warfare's most overlooked casualty: the systematic collapse of civilian communication that connected families, friends and communities during humanity's darkest hours. This single piece of correspondence, delayed for over a century, illuminates how total war transformed reliable institutions into fragile networks where personal connections could vanish without warning or explanation. Christabel's words to Katie, preserved through architectural accident and bureaucratic chaos, remind us that behind every military campaign lay millions of ordinary people struggling to maintain human bonds across distances made infinite by systematic failure. The Great War didn't just reshape borders and topple empires. It revealed the hidden vulnerabilities in the networks that held civilization together, networks we still depend on today. This story serves as educational exploration of historical events, with respect for all communities affected by wartime communication breakdown. What other institutional failures might be hidden in the shadows of history, waiting to teach us about the true costs of conflict?